PatZi with a Z. Welcome to Joy on Paper, a program for writers and those who dream of writing. Today, I have a wonderful guest, and he's been on the program before, a year ago, and of course, he's been busy, like all writers. Once they start writing, they can't stop because they know the joy on paper. So I'm so happy to welcome to the program today Mark Laporta, and he has a new book. It's part of a new series, and the new book is called Probability Shadow. We'll let him tell us about this new series he's writing. Hi, Mark.
Hi there. How are you?
Wow, I'm great. I'm still so hyped up the BoucherCon convention here for mystery writers, so I'm looking forward to, now I'm going to go to the next sci-fi writers convention because it's just so much fun to be around so many writers.
Well, that's nice to know. We do our best to make you happy.
Now, Probability Shadow is part of a new series that you're starting. What's the new series called?
It's called Against the Glare of Darkness. It's a long-range story of a fight against evil, and of course, ultimately the recognition that evil is an integral part of the universe and not something that can really be stomped out, but may be adapted to, and so on. And in this case, there is a central mystery. It's not a mystery novel, but there's a little bit of mystery. There's an interstellar civilization. We're looking at about 3,000 years in the future. It's a vast interstellar civilization that's been disrupted by an emerging evil, a species of mutants that's been trapped in a multidimensional prison for many thousand years, has come forward and created a crisis using their unprecedented control of probability. They've managed to create an artificial shortage of rare minerals that are absolutely essential to artificial intelligence and space travel, and of course that's the backbone of the interstellar civilization. So what we have is a band of sort of mismatched aliens, let's say, from different species who unite under the banner of a sentient crustacean to, stop the onslaught of the ancient race, which is known as the Quishics, and their quest to destroy really all of sentient life because they feed on mental energy. And you have the political powers, once the shortage is created, are fighting against each other. You've got the Terran Protectorate, which is a sort of human empire, military and economic, and slightly fascist, should say. You have on the other hand, the crustaceans, the Richard Sidereal Caucus. They're more philosophical and ethical, and they offer a different way for planets to unite, in more of a benign relationship. Then you have the Caldex Assembly, which is a group of symbiotes that have their own stealthy agenda. They sneak in and out of other beings' bodies and learn their secrets and use that to manipulate the stock market and the banking industry. And so they've got a whole sort of empire of their own that's in the shadows. And one of the central part of the central population is an isolated species called the Draw Line that live on planet Ladrone, where the story opens up, because Ladrone is one of the few places left in the settled universe that has a sufficient supply of these rare minerals. And so all these political powers are converging there for an interstellar trade conference to try to get the lion's share of that. And it's to that planet that Ambassador Ungent Draf of Richard comes to do what he thinks is a simple negotiation until he uncovers the emergence of the Quishics, and the whole thing starts to unravel from there.
Wow. It's so, as I said last year when you were on and we were talking about the changing heart of Ixtahan Daharak, I was impressed with your ability to come out with characters that were so believable and wonderful names. And I think that's part of the fun of your books. Now, sometimes people will say, well, the name sounds strange, but it's funny, once you get into this, once one starts reading your book, I just found that, first of all, I got to know the characters, and I don't know where you get all these names from. You've got a lot of stuff in that head of yours, and it reminds me a little bit of Mike Resnick. Mike Resnick, of course, is the sci-fi. He is like the grandfather of sci-fi here because he has won, I think, every sci-fi award. And I've always told him that I would just love to be in one of those little capsules that goes around in his brain because it must be so fascinating. But I think you have the same brain because you have a lot of things in there.
Yeah, I contain multitude. And of course, creating all those names is a very important way to keep everything distinct. I mean, I've got 4 or 5 different species and civilizations that I want people to keep clear in their heads. So I created a distinctive body of names for each, just so that there's just very little confusion whose interests are being represented when somebody's talking.
Well, I so enjoy, the minute I started reading about Ambassador Ungent Draf, is that the right way to pronounce it?
Yes, Ungent Draf, yes. He's known as Har Ungent Draf formally, but anyway.
Well, I thought he was a fascinating character, and all of them. It's just like one after another. You have so many. So why don't you just tell us a little bit more about some of the characters, and then so that when people are reading the book, they'll be able to read along with you, and just tell us more about some of the characters. I liked, for example, you have Shoal, which is I think,
Right.
and Yaldric, and how do you pronounce Lalam for?
Oh, Dalalam.
Ah.
She's the Outre AI. We'll talk about that.
Yeah.
Well, we can start with Ungern himself. Ungern Prof is a distinguished crustacean and ambassador from the Grashard Sidereal Caucus. He's approaching his 100th year. He's been in the diplomatic corps for 80 years. The Grashardi live longer, much longer than the humans do, so it's not so unusual for him to be. But he's still getting on in years, and he's decided to take. He was thinking of retiring. He decided to take one last diplomatic mission because he's still trying to get over the grief of the loss of his daughter, his adult daughter Florence, who was murdered by some terrorists. She was a journalist. She wanted to investigate the Kresovic militant camp. She went in there to interview one of the leaders and was executed. So he's got a heavy heart. He figures, I've got to have a change of scene. So he accepts this diplomatic mission, and that's what places him in the middle of this vast interstellar conflict.
Now he's from Grashard.
That's right.
And tell us a little bit about Grashard.
Well, Grashard is a planet very distant from Earth. It's a society that values philosophy, ethical considerations. They have a very liberal mindset. They're a real contrast to the Terran Protectorate, who uses muscle and might and intimidation to pull people together. They have open trade agreement, open borders, that kind of thing, and everything is. They're very cultured in one way, but they're also very hedonistic. I mean, everything in their society revolves around comfort and graciousness and even-temperedness and rationality and that kind of thing. So they're not given to extremes, and they are always looking for the most ethical path through things. And you would say that their cities are very beautiful and cultured and all that kind of thing. The level of education is very high. It's that kind of an environment. You've already mentioned Shoal, who is a Kresovic. Now, the Kresovic are a genetically altered branch of the human race. Early on, when the humans were the first out of the gate with interstellar travel of all of these different sentient worlds, and there's a lot of problem with radiation and pressure and so on and so forth, and the humans are having trouble establishing the colonies because it was too dangerous. So an Eastern European geneticist named Nikola Kresovic came up with a way to remap the genome. This is again in the very far future of humanity, so that a certain select group would have some of the properties of radiation-resistant beetles, so they could withstand higher levels of radiation, higher levels of pressure, get along with a little less oxygen. And so for many generations, for centuries, the Kresovics were the advanced team building the infrastructure for a colony so that the humans could settle it. But then what happened was, after a while, technology improved, because it was much cheaper to use the Kresovics than to build all the specialized robots and machinery that they would need to do this. But several centuries later, the humans reached the point where it was really not so difficult for them or expensive to build the robotics that they needed, and the Kresovics became obsolete. And there were already a lot of people who thought, well, why do we want these scummy mutants around anyway? Because they look different. They have slightly greenish skin. They have an elongated skull. They have hair that's very different from human hair. You would still say they were related to humans in the way they looked, but they're clearly different looking. And so they were shunned as mutants and relegated to the less prosperous planets. And they had a lot of technical skills, so they were able to find jobs on lesser planets that needed technical support. But of course, they couldn't really earn enough money to support themselves, and that's where the terrorist group grew up from in response to that, because they were really being discriminated against by the humans. Now, Saul has no direct connection to that. It's just that he happens to be a Kresovic. He's an orphan, and he's been living on the street since he was 9, and he had worked for a crime boss on one of the sort of lesser worlds. But one day, he's delivering this sort of top secret, it's actually a bracelet, but there's a lot more to it, and to one of his clients, and he accidentally sees the client's face, and so that's a big no-no, and so someone chases him down and throws him into this horrible, horrible prison, and eventually the person who throws him in the prison, the reason she does it is because she recognizes that the bracelet is actually part of a large interstellar conspiracy, and she wants to make sure that the boy doesn't say anything about the bracelet to anybody else. So she throws her in the prison. Then she goes to the leader of the Drow line, who are on Ladron, and negotiates with that. This boy is brought to Ladron for questioning, and there's a complicated reason for why that particular planet has been chosen, because Ladron is right near a black hole, the Fremdel event horizon, where as the symbiotes know, the evil Krishiks have been trapped in that region for a long time, and they're about to emerge. So it's hard to explain in a few words. But anyway, so he's sitting there in Ladron, and he's very unruly, and the leader of the Drow line that Ungern has been sent to work with says, well, can you help me teach the manners to this boy? And so eventually he becomes Shoal's tutor, and together they get involved further in solving the crisis. A bit more long-winded than I intended. But anyway, there are also two representatives of the Terran Protectorate, Captain Harlan Mars and his XO, Dillian Cavendish. She hails from a region of Earth curiously known as Great Britain for reasons no one can remember, so she has a slight accent and speaks in that slightly curious way. And the two of them have a sort of off-center relationship. They're definitely part of the Terran Protectorate, but they feel a little queasy sometimes about what they're being ordered to do. There's also, as I was mentioning, the Draw Line, the head of the Draw Line world government is Shadron Drashna, who has a 7-year-old daughter named Koronia, who will become much more important in Book 2. Let's see, who else am I leaving out? Well, then there's the symbiote who's the one that captured Shoal and put him in the prison. Her name is Warpex, and she's very much a cynical, self-serving, but extremely effective and efficient being who knows how to get what she wants. And she has an early encounter with Ungern. Let's see, am I leaving out anyone?
Well,
really significant.
No,
but certainly enough to work with.
I think that is, and it's now normally. I'll tell you the truth. Normally, I don't let authors just talk about all their characters, but I specifically wanted you to do so because I think that you have created here. For anyone, now I love sci-fi and I so enjoy going into it, just the escape of sci-fi. But I think that for anyone who doesn't have a background in reading sci-fi, I think reading this book is a great way to start because, as I said, you do develop your characters so beautifully. They have depth. They have personalities that one can really relate to, and that there is this challenge. When you're writing sci-fi, that you do have to have some different name, something different. And once somebody reads your books, they will remember these characters. And with the names that are now right now, when you first read them and you see like a strange combination of letters that might not, don't look particularly, they're not Tom, Dick, and Harry. But
right.
once you get into it, like Ungent, once you start to know these characters, you remember their names and you remember their personalities, which is so vital in getting people involved in a book. And now, of course, you're planning this as a big saga of a lot of books, right?
Well, a trilogy. I'm working on book 2 now, and it extends the themes of that are developed here and takes it to the next level. And then book 3 will bring some kind of resolution, which will be unexpected. And one of the distinctions I make is not only between humans and unfamiliar species, but also between those and androids. There are a couple of different classes of artificial intelligence. There's Yaldrint, who is Ungern's assistant, and right now she's inside a casing. She's not mobile, so he has to bring her everywhere. But she's often correcting him or getting his thinking on track, or just balancing out some of his thinking, and he relies on her very heavily. And she has her own personality. She's extremely polite. She has a mellow sort of alto voice, and speaks very very formally, but with a lot of warmth in a certain way.
Well, this is the fun of your book and of talking to you, is that they're so real to you. Well, I love sci-fi because you do get out of this world, literally, and then the nice thing, you bring in so many ideas and concepts that it makes one think. And I like a book where I start wondering, well, will this exist? Will this happen? Simple things like you mentioned sublight speed. And you where do you get all the technical stuff that you put into your books?
Well, some of it is traditional science fiction lore, but, I try to go beyond. I'm not a scientist, but I try to use as much correct scientific terminology as I can, even when I'm coming up with something that doesn't exist. So it has a framework that's more believable, and also I have the restraint that you need to keep a story from flying off the handle. Because, of course, when you're writing, if you just write anything that comes into your head, you're going to have an amorphous blob that, in other words, a story with no rules doesn't actually exist as a story. If your world doesn't have any boundaries. So within reason, I just try to, I'm a graduate of Google University and Wikipedia College, and you try to get the terminology right, get everything. And what I do is I stay just within what I know and what I understand. I don't go beyond it. I just kind of have clear facts and then allude to a few things and then move on, because I don't really want the story to get bogged down in deep scientific detail, because it doesn't interest me to write hard science fiction. That's a completely different genre. And I've read there's some great examples, like by the author Stephen Baxter, for example, where he has a mission to explore the interior of the sun, and it's fascinating, but it's not the kind of story I want to write. I'm more interested in characters and emotions and that kind of thing.
As I said, your character development is so good. When one is reading your books, and this goes for the last trilogy and now the beginning of this one, I really started to care about the characters, and even the characters without a body. I cared about them, and I wanted to know more, and I wanted to see the development.
Well, thanks. I mean, that's what I'm focused on, is the characters. The characters are. It's a little cute to say the characters are telling me the story, but I do, when I'm working on things, I think what's happening next in this character's mind, and I allow that to affect what's going on. So, of course, you start with some general idea of what plot should be or what direction you're going in. But if I find that I've created a situation where the characters can't be themselves, then I just have to push that aside and think of a new way forward for the story or for the book, because that really is what brings it to life to me. That's what makes book entertaining and also moving. Again, it's all about personal preference rather than philosophy. Some people really value having a thrilling plot per se and an intricate plot with twists of particular kinds, and that's definitely one way to go. But my real interest is his character.
Now, you mentioned that you're not a scientist. What's your background?
Well, I mean, I do have a little bit of science in the background, in the sense that my father was a research chemist. He worked in rubbers and plastics, and I have had a brother who was a programmer. So I grew up kind of in a scientific background, and I'm very interested in that. But I've spent most of my life in the arts, and I've earned my living for many years in advertising as a copywriter. I also studied music for many years, and I still write music. And most of my impetus to write books comes from just an artist's observation, because an artist is an observer first and foremost, I think. And I think if the characters have that kind of depth, because I've always been observing and making notes of, not really so consciously, but I absorb easily different types of people, different situations, and of course on the world stage to use as a model for, a book about interstellar intrigue, but that helps a lot. There's a lot of material there to draw from.
Were you always interested in sci-fi?
Yeah, I was always fascinated. Well, I was always fascinated by a couple of things. One was astronomy. I never had the patience to be a scientist. I mean, you really have to love details and data, and I appreciate that and I value it, but I don't have the patience for it in some ways. But I was also interested in archaeology. I was absolutely insane about ancient Egypt when I was little. Things like medieval armor, and I guess they were, what you say they had in common is they were all otherworldly. Everyday life get much the same, but you look at a piece of medieval armor with all of the scrolling. I mean, the dress armor, not the battle armor, plumes, the colors, the different metals. It's the same with ancient Egyptians or the Mayans. And so, science fiction had an ability to also take you out of that sort of everyday realm. I also, of course, am enthralled with the Lord of the Rings and the whole idea of world building there, because, I mean, if you want to talk about world building, there's no better example. He wrote the novels, but he preceded the novels with years and years of just notes about this culture that is behind it, not writing novels at all, but inventing all the elfin languages and so on and so forth. So he went the total world building route and then decided, maybe I'll write a novel. It was it was almost like it was an afterthought. I mean, I may not have that exactly right, but that's the way it seems sometimes. That was doing all of this because he was a language scholar who was doing all of this in his spare time, and then said, "Oh, I could make a novel out of this." So that's my answer. That there are all those different influences. I grew up reading a lot of Isaac Asimov. I must have read every one of his major novels and every one of his short stories.
Oh, so did I. I was obsessed with him for
Yeah.
I had like a 2-year obsession with him that I had to read everything he ever wrote.
Well, mine lasted longer than 2 years, and I finally got to the point where I said, okay, that's enough. I must have read Foundation's Edge, for example, in particular. For some reason, that book really got to me. I must have read that at least 6 times. I don't usually do that at all, but there's just, first of all, there's something about his point of view. It's so broad. Even though, he was a scientist, he didn't write like a scientist. He wrote like someone with a broader humanistic education. I mean, he wrote a lot about Shakespeare, and sometimes in his lighter stories, short stories, you had mentioned Gilbert and Sullivan. There's a short story of his where it's all just puns about Gilbert and Sullivan that would make cringe. So he had an interesting point of view about society in general, and I think some of that definitely seeped into my phone. So in some ways, it isn't necessarily science fiction. It was just the mind of a particular person that happened to be writing in this medium. But I've also, I mean, when I did try to write, it took me many years to get to the point where I felt like I'd found my voice and I had the courage to actually say, yes, I can write a novel. I'd write shorter things, but I always felt I could write my more characteristic. The stuff that was really coming from the best place was stuff that involved some element of fantasy or science fiction or otherworldly element, because that's what would get me excited. I'd respond to the fact that it wasn't the everyday thing, domestic disputes or car accidents or whatever.
I think your books are so enjoyable. For people who have not read sci-fi, this is a good book, I think, to start, because there's something very reassuring. I'm not sure if that's the right word, but there's something in there, kind of hopefulness. Although there are all sorts of problems in the future, and we have all these society's problems are reflected in your book, but
Right.
There is an underlying hopefulness that I found in the books. But otherwise, it would have been too depressing,
It has a lot to do with how I see things. I mean, a lot of the problems that we have are the problems that we create for ourselves, but we also have very much the resources to solve the problem. It's all a matter of mindset. And in this story, it takes this major crisis with this enemy that's going to threatens to consume everybody, that people realize, well, wait, what are our real best interests, and where are the ways that we have to pull together and forget about the old battles that we fought amongst each other, and
and join together and cooperate. So I think that's why I finished the book, and I said, first I'm looking forward to the next one, but then I'm saying, okay, I think it's going to work out. I hope it's going to work out. And I said, Mark's doing a great job here. I wanted to mention also that you are published by Chickadee Prince, and they are a wonderful little publishing house.
Chickadee Prince Books, it's a small press based in Brooklyn, and they publish not just science fiction. There is another science fiction writer, Stephen Druckmann, but there's also literary fiction, so it's a very wide range.
What I love about them is they're so enthusiastic about their authors. Publishers come to me and say, so I want to thank Chickadee Prince. I want to thank you so much, Mark.
You don't write to be famous. You don't write to get published even. You write to write, and you write to tell the story in the most authentic way that you can. And if you do that and you stay true to yourself and you keep developing your craft, mostly by work, the main thing is to just keep going with it. Then the work will start to glow in some way. It'll start to resonate with other people, and you might end up getting a nice interview from PatZi Gill someday, and that'll be quite an early pinnacle in your career, and that'll be very useful to you. I mean, it's all just writing because it means something to you. What I get out of the writing is so much more than if I were to win an award, or sure, I'd love to make $1 billion off this book and have it made into a movie and all that other stuff. I'm not saying I don't, but that's not what's driving me to do it. I've got stuff to say, and I finally found a way to say it, and now it's coming out through these books, and it just feels great.
I think you say it beautifully, and the new book is a space opera for adults, and it's called Probability Shadow, the first book in the new trilogy Against the Glare of Darkness, and it's available wherever books are sold. And
you can go to chickadeeprince.com to get more information about the book. I also have a Facebook page that's called Heart of Earth, the science fiction website. You can find that, and there I publish short fiction on a regular basis that's unrelated to any of the novels, although you can find links to my novels and a recording of me reading the first chapter of Heart of Earth.
Again, Mark, I want to thank you so much for joining me today. Day on Joy on Paper. And again, thank you so much for giving me a wonderful read because I really enjoyed it.
Well, thanks so much, PatZi, and thanks for having your show. And it's really great to have the support.
Talk to you next year.
All right, take care. Bye.
Bye-bye. Okay, well, he is, as I said, he's a great guy. You will enjoy this book. Okay, bye-bye now.